Welcome to Convention of States, a project of Citizens for Self-Governance. Well, we've discussed in the past what Article 5 is about, which gives the states the rights to call a Convention of States. Let's now look at exactly what is a Convention of States. And I think a good starting point would be to look at all the conventions of states that have been held since the ratification of the Constitution, so we can understand and learn how they were operated. So let's take a look at that list. Well, here is the list of all conventions of states that have been held since ratification of our Constitution. As you can see, there haven't been any. So when we hold our convention, we are literally going to be making history. Even though there haven't been any, we still have a good idea as to what it will look like. So let's see. Well, we do know that in early America, conventions traditionally fell into two categories. The first category was to address issues within an individual colony or state. These types of conventions generally assumed governance from day to day of the colonies. The second category was what is called as a multi-government gathering. These were gatherings or conventions involved to address interstate issues. These were later referred to as committees of states or conventions of states. Conventions were, in essence, problem-solving events. Today, we might call these a task force. Well, also, we know that by 1787, protocols for multi-government gatherings or conventions were standardized and generally accepted. By using a military term, SOP, they were considered pretty well standard operating procedures. The procedure involved the sponsor drafting a document referred to as a call or application, specifying time, place, and subject matter. Subject matter is very important. Subject matter limited the convention agenda. The sponsor then directed the call or the application to the parties that were to be invited. So let's take a look at what we mean by subject matter. Well, subject matter is a very important part of the Convention of States plan. As we mentioned earlier, a unique application process is part of our goal in implementing our plan. Here pictured is in fact the application that we want all the states to sign on to, word for word. And I'm going to read the important part of this application, and that is a convention of states limited to proposing amendments to the Constitution of the United States that impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. So our application strategy is that all 34 states that are required submit the very same exactly worded application. Because remember now, the subject matter limits the convention agenda. And we'll see later as to why this strategy is so important. But for now, let's move on and take a look at the rules. Well, as concerns convention rules, some generally accepted rules and traditional practices will come into play. The first two here, one vote per state and a decision is being made by simple majority were both rules that came from earlier multi-state gatherings. Now, as far as electronic devices being allowed and transparency being very important, those will of course have to be incorporated in the rules, and those are more modern day realities that we will have to contend with. The last item on the list, Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedures. This source is very important and requires us to take a little closer look. So let's do that. Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedures. This source could be the overriding guide to determining rules at a convention of states. It's the official authority of most state legislatures in the United States. It is to state legislatures what Robert's Rules of Order is to clubs and groups that we all have participated in. Now, mind you, all these suggestions on rules are just suggestions. The actual rules will be determined at the convention. Okay, let's move on now and let's look at the selection of commissioners, or some refer to as delegates. Well, here's what we know about the selection of commissioners. The states are free to select their commissioners as they deem proper. States are free to determine the size of the committee that they send to the Convention of States. Probably the number of commissioners allowed on the floor at any one time will be a limited number. And it is expected that at a modern day Convention of States, we're looking at probably 200 to 250 commissioners. Again, this is strictly a projection. Now, most states will severely limit their commissioners or delegates by giving them a very limited amount of authority. And some states will be very, very controlling in this matter. Indiana happens to be one of those states that is very controlling. So, as an example, let's take a look at Indiana's rules for its commissioners. All right, let's take a look at Indiana's model legislation with regard to delegate selection and delegate limitations. As far as selection is concerned, Indiana will send 2 delegates and 2 alternates. Each delegate must take an oath to uphold the state and U.S. constitutions and to abide by instructions given by the state legislature. Delegates may not be government employees or lobbyists. With regard to the limitations that they have to abide by, a vote cast outside of the instructions given to them is void. Any delegate who casts such a vote forfeits appointment and is guilty of a Class D felony. General Assembly's application calling for an Article 5 convention then is rendered ineffective if delegates vote outside of their instructions. So you can see Indiana is very, very strict on selection and authority given to their delegates. Well, our discussion wouldn't be complete if we didn't recognize the opposition that's out there against our efforts at a convention of states. So let's delve into that area. Well, opposition takes the form of a disinformation campaign. The disinformation campaign has really grown throughout the 20th century. So for our purposes, let's focus there on the 20th century. The start of the campaign can be traced to 3 major sources: congressional leaders, academics, and Supreme Court justices. The whole campaign, however, can be centered around certain basic claims that permeate throughout the whole campaign. And those are as follows. First, little is known about the process and how it's supposed to operate. Second, a convention for proposing amendments would be an uncontrollable constitutional convention. Now, the term here, constitutional convention, we believe can be traced back to a speech made in 1911 by a then Senator Weldon Hayburn, a Republican from Idaho. He used of course, he was speaking in opposition to an Article 5 convention, and he used the term constitutional convention. In other words, that this would turn into a rewrite of the Constitution. The term con, we might also mention, comes from the term constitutional convention. Next claim, a convention for proposing amendments could be controlled or manipulated by Congress. And lastly, a convention for proposing amendments could unilaterally impose radical constitutional change. Okay, let's now take a look at some key individuals in each of the three sources that we mentioned for the Disinformation Campaign. Well, the first source of the Disinformation Campaign that we'll look at is the field of academics. Two professors are highlighted here. The first one is Professor Charles Black. He was a Columbia and Yale law professor. And in 1963, he published an article regarding the Article 5 process. It was entitled, "The Proposed Amendment of Article 5, a Threatened Disaster." Obviously, he was against any kind of an Article 5 Convention of States. And he really objected to the states being able to overrule Congress or the Supreme Court. He later, in 1972, also published another article basically attacking the limited to subject matter, quote-unquote, clause. So he was a very, very prominent law professor that was very critical of the Article 5 process. Also, another professor, Professor William Swindler, he was a law professor at the College of William and Mary. Also in 1963, he published in the Georgetown Law Journal, and he basically stipulated that Congress should have control over any convention, and that only a federal agency is competent to propose amendments to the Constitution. So any convention procedure should be totally disregarded. Well, both professors, we will see later on, were tremendous influences on certain Supreme Court justices. So let's move on to the next source of disinformation, which was the Congressional Leaders. Well, we know many congressional leaders spoke out against Article 5 Convention of States, all while addressing certain political debates that they were involved in at their time. I'm only highlighting three here. As I said, there are many, many more that we could highlight, but due to time limitations, I'm only going to pick these three. The first one is Senator William Proxmire. He was a proponent of the uncontrollable convention claim. The next senator, Senator Joseph Tidings, his main thing was that states should disregard state legislative proposals. So he was opposed to anything coming out of the states as far as amending the Constitution. The last one is Senator Paul Simon. He felt that the Article 5 convention process was a very dangerous path to go down. I included Senator Simon because this was one of my dad's favorite senators. We're from the state of Illinois, and Senator Simon was our senator in the state of Illinois, and Dad always liked him because he actually came to his front door and asked for his vote. So my dad, you have to remember, was a lifetime Republican, but he always had good things to say about Senator Simon. So now let's move on to some Supreme Court justices. Two Supreme Court justices made significant disinformation campaign contributions. The first is Chief Justice Warren. He was also a very close follower of Professor Black and Professor Swindler. And his basis was that he thought the convention could soon destroy the foundations of the Constitution. The second justice was Justice Warren Burger. And while he was considered a conservative, he felt the Constitutional Convention, that it would turn into a Constitutional Convention, and that the convention would in fact completely disregard its agenda or its subject matter. So he played a major role in, of course, Roe versus Wade. And I might mention that 19 states applied for an Article 5 convention for the purpose of repealing Roe versus Wade, but of course they did not reach the threshold necessary to hold the convention, and that was due to a large amount due to Chief Justice Burger and his position on the Article 5 convention. Again, both were influenced heavily by Professors Black and Swindler. So we might as well move on and highlight and recognize the opposition groups that exist out there today. Well, as far as major opposition groups that we run into day in and day out, there are three major ones, and those are Eagle Forum, John Birch Society, and the National Association for Gun Rights. So they are very active out there, circulating emails, contacting legislators, and basically putting out, again, disinformation, and everything they put out seems to be centered around the claim of fear, and that of a runaway convention or a constitutional convention or taking rights away from individual citizens. So everything seems to be centered around fear. Well, the good news is that the tide is turning, and it's turning in our favor. And I must say, the Convention of States movement has been playing a significant role in the turning of this tide. First of all, the disinformation claims made from the past have lost credibility. The inaccuracies spread during disinformation campaigns have been basically corrected. Also, many conservative and moderate convention opponents have in fact become supporters. Groups that persist in spreading misinformation have lost a great deal of credibility. Conservatives, moderates, and even some progressives now are demanding accountability from these groups. So momentum is once again building for an Article 5 Convention of States. In closing, I would like to leave you with this quote. The founders gave us a legitimate path to save our liberty by using our own state governments to impose binding restraints on the federal government. It is time to dust off the tool the founders gave us in Article 5 and get started. Thank you.